The morning after the funeral, the village of Marbury decided what Eleanor Wraith had become, and it decided in the porch of St. Aldwyn's Church, while her husband's grave was still soft. She stood at the lych gate in a gown dyed black only the week before, the dye, uneven at the hems where the cloth had been turned twice already, and she listened to the rector's widow speak her sentence, in a voice pitched to carry. 3 years married and not one child to show for it, the woman said. And now not even a husband to keep her. Eleanor did not turn her head. She had learned that turning the head invited the next remark, and the next, and that stillness was the only coat warm enough for a morning like this one. She kept her gloved hands folded at her waist, the left glove worn through at the seam of the thumb, and she watched the bare elms drip the last of the night's rain onto the stones, and she let the words settle over her like a second morning. Barren. The village had been waiting 3 years to say it aloud, and a fresh grave had given it leave. What none of them knew on that gray morning was that a sealed letter had arrived at the manor 2 days before her husband died, a letter she had not yet found the courage to open, and that the man whose name was written on its outer fold had already begun the long ride north to find her. Stay with me, because the woman they were burying alive at that gate had more living left in her than any of them could have guessed, and the one who would finally see it was not yet in the room. Eleanor Wraith was 24 years old, and had been a wife and was now a widow. And between those two stations the world had left her almost nothing. The manor at Marbury was not hers. It had been her husband's, held under an entail that ran to the male line, and the male line now meant a cousin she had met exactly twice, a soft-handed man named Mr. Crail, who had attended the funeral in a coat too new for grief, and had spent the burial studying the roof slates as though already counting their worth. Her own portion, the money her father had settled on her at the wedding, had been spent in the 2nd year of the marriage on debts her husband had not mentioned until the creditors did. She had a trunk of turned gowns, a mother's thin gold ring she had not been able to bring herself to sell, and a name the village had decided meant nothing. She walked home from the church alone because there was no one to walk with her. The lane climbed between hedges, still black with wet, and the manor rose at the top of it, square and plain and cold, its windows showing no fire, because she had let the last of the coal go to the kitchen where it was needed more. Inside, the housekeeper waited in the hall, the only servant who had not given notice. A broad, steady woman of 60, named Mrs. Petch, who had buried 2 husbands of her own, and who had never once in 3 years called her Mistress Barren, or anything, but Madam spoken plain. Mrs. Petch took the wet mantle from her shoulders and said only that there was broth, and that Mr. Crail's man had been by, to ask when the lady meant to remove herself, and that she had told him the lady would remove herself when she was good and ready, and not before. Eleanor sat by the kitchen fire that afternoon with the unopened letter in her lap. She had found it in her husband's desk the night he died, pushed beneath the blotter as though hidden, and the hand on the outside was a stranger's, firm and dark, and the name it gave was not her husband's but her own maiden name. Miss Eleanor Hartley, it read, as though the writer did not know she had married at all. She turned it over and over and did not break the seal. There had been too many letters in the last 3 years that brought only worse news, and she had not the strength that day for another. She set it on the mantel behind the candlestick, where she would see it, and not have to touch it, and she told herself she would open it when she was stronger. She did not yet know that the man who had written it was at that hour changing horses at the posting inn 9 miles south, nor that the news inside was the first good news the house had held in years. She did not weep for her husband. That was its own small shame, and she carried it. He had not been cruel, only careless, a man who had married her for the portion her father offered and had spent it, and then spent the affection too, until what remained between them was a courteous distance maintained across a dinner table. She had wanted children. That want had been the truest thing in her, and the years had taken it from her one disappointed month at a time. And somewhere in the 2nd year, she had stopped letting herself hope, because hope, refused often enough, becomes a wound that will not close. When the village said, "Barren," They meant a fault in her body. What they could not see was the deeper fault they had pressed into her, the belief, settled now and quiet, that she was a woman built to be left. The man came to the manor 3 days later, in the last light of a cold afternoon, on a tired bay horse with the mud of a long road on its legs. Eleanor saw him from the upper window before Mrs. Blank. Petch announced him, and her first thought was that he had the bearing of a man who was never refused entry anywhere. He sat his horse the way some men wear a title, without effort and without apology. And when he dismounted in the yard, he did it in one unhurried motion and stood a moment looking up at the plain front of the house as though measuring it. He was perhaps 34, tall and broad, through the shoulder, dark-haired, with a face that the cold had set into hard planes and a jaw held like something carved. He wore a dark blue traveling coat cut by a London hand and a white cravat tied without fuss, and boots that had been good before the road ruined them. He did not look like a creditor. He looked like a man who had ridden a great distance for a reason he meant to see through. Mrs. Petch showed him into the cold drawing-room, and Eleanor came down to him with the worn glove turned. So the hole did not show, and he turned from the dead hearth and looked at her, and something in his face went very still. It was a small thing. A stranger would have missed it. Eleanor, who had spent 3 years reading the small weather of a man's face for the storms it warned of, saw the stillness arrive, and did not know what to make of it, because it was not pity, and it was not appraisal, and it was not the swift dismissal she had grown to expect. He looked at her as though he had been told to expect a certain thing, and had found another, standing in its place. He gave his name as the Duke of Ashbourne, and he said it the way a man states a fact he is tired of carrying, and Eleanor's hand found the back of the nearest chair, a duke. In her dead husband's cold drawing-room with the dye uneven on her hems and no fire to offer him, he saw the hand on the chair-back. He saw, she was certain, all of it, the cold and the worn glove and the empty grate, and he did not let his face make any remark upon it, and for that small mercy she was absurdly grateful. He had come, he said, on a matter of business that concerned her late father. He asked with a care that surprised her whether she had received a letter. Eleanor said that a letter had come, and that she had not opened it. The Duke of Ashbourne was quiet for a moment, and then he said that perhaps it would be better if she opened it now, and that he would wait. There was no impatience in it. It was, she would think later, the first command he ever gave her, though it did not sound like one, and, like all the commands that followed, it was a thing dressed as instruction that was in truth a kind of shelter. She fetched the letter from the kitchen mantel. She broke the seal with cold fingers while he stood at the window with his back turned, giving her the courtesy of not being watched, and she read. The letter was from a firm of solicitors in London, and it told her, in the dry, careful language of men who are paid, to be certain that her father's elder brother, an uncle she had never met, a man who had gone to the West Indies as a young man and made a great deal of money and quarreled with his family and never come home, had died 11 months before without issue, and that under the terms of his will the whole of his estate passed to the eldest surviving child of his only brother, which was to say to her, there was a house in Somerset called Wexley, and the land that went with it. There was money in the funds, a sum so large the letter wrote it out twice as though distrusting itself. And there was a title held by special remainder, an old barony that her uncle had been granted late in life for services to the crown in the islands. A barony that the letter said, in its careful way, could descend through the female line in default of male heirs. She was, the letter informed her, the Baroness Wexley in her own right, had been for 11 months, and had been living in a cold borrowed house in Marbury, while the village buried her under a word. She read it twice. The paper shook in her hand, and she made it stop. When she looked up, the Duke had turned from the window, and was watching her with that same arrested stillness, and she understood that he had known the contents before she read them, that the solicitors were his solicitors, or his friends, that he had ridden north not as a stranger, but as a man discharging a duty to the memory of someone. He told her then, briefly and without ornament, that her uncle in his last years had been his neighbor in Somerset, that the two of them had been something near to friends despite the difference in their ages, and that the old man dying had asked him to see the thing done properly, to find the niece and put the inheritance into her own hands, rather than let it pass through agents who might be tempted by a woman alone and ignorant of her rights. He had given his word, he said, and he had come to keep it. If the village of Marbury had its own machinery for grinding a woman small, the world, the letter opened, had a machinery of its own, larger and finer and no less cruel, and Eleanor was about to be carried into the heart of it. The Duke arranged everything with a quiet competence that left her breathless. Mr. D., Frail arriving the next morning to press again for her removal, found a Duke in the drawing-room, and discovered all at once a great deal of patience he had not previously owned. The cousin's soft hands and new coat folded before rank like paper before flame. By the week's end, Eleanor had left Marbury behind her. The cold manor and the dripping elms and the rector's widow with her pitched voice, and she traveled south in a hired chaise with Mrs. Mara. Petch beside her, for she had asked the housekeeper to come, and the housekeeper had said she had been waiting 3 years to be asked. Wexley was nothing like the house she had left. It stood in a fold of green Somerset hills, a long, warm house of honey-colored stone, with tall windows that held the afternoon light, and there were fires in every room when she arrived, because the Duke had sent word ahead. And there was a staff that curtsied to her, and called her my lady, and did not know that a village to the north had called her something else. She walked through the rooms that first evening like a woman moving through a dream she expected to be woken from. In the long gallery she found a portrait of her uncle as a young man, dark-eyed and unsmiling, and she stood before it a long while. This stranger who had reached out of the grave to give her a life, and she did not know whether to thank him or to weep, and in the end she did a little of both. It was in her second week at Wexley that the thing happened which changed the shape of everything. And it happened in the village, in the small shop of a sick widow, whose husband had been her uncle's gamekeeper. Eleanor had gone down to the village to begin learning the people who were now in some sense hers, and she had found the gamekeeper's widow abed, with a fever and 2 small children underfoot, a boy and a girl of perhaps 3 years, twins, with their mother's fair hair and their father lately dead of the same fever that now held the mother. The parish had already begun to speak of sending the children to the workhouse at Taunton, for there was no family to take them, and a sick woman could not keep them. Eleanor heard this spoken in the shop by the apothecary's wife, spoken plainly in front of the children themselves, as though they were sacks to be carried, and something in her that the years had pressed flat stood suddenly upright. She did not announce a decision. She simply sat down on the low stool by the widow's bed, and took the woman's hot hand, and said that the children would not go to any workhouse, that she would see them kept, and that the widow was to think of nothing but getting well. The boy Thomas came and leaned against her knee with the unhesitating trust that small children give and grown people have to earn, and the girl Susan watched from the doorway with her thumb in her mouth, and Eleanor read to them from the only book in the cottage, a torn primer, her voice low and steady in the small hot room until both children slept. She did not know that the Duke of Ashbourne had ridden down to Wexley village on an errand of his own, and had stopped at the open door of the cottage when he heard a voice he recognized, and that he had stood there, in the lane, unseen, and watched a baroness who owned half the valley sit on a milking stool, and read a torn primer to a gamekeeper's orphans, as though there were nothing in the world she would rather do. He said nothing to her of it then. The Duke, who had been courteous and competent and distant, became from that day a Duke who found a great many reasons to ride to Wexley. He came to advise her on the management of the estate, which she did need, for she had never run anything larger than a kitchen. He came to bring papers from the solicitors. He came once, with no reason given at all, and stood in her long gallery looking at her uncle's portrait beside her, and said that the old man would have liked her, and Eleanor, who had learned to distrust kindness because kindness in Marbury had always carried a hook, found that she could not distrust this. His manner did not soften in the way other men's manners softened. With compliments and warmth laid on like paint, it stayed level and grave. Yet she began to notice that he watched her hands when she poured the tea, and that he had learned without being told that she took no sugar, and that when the wind came up cold off the hills, he would say, in the flat voice of a man giving an order, that she should come away from the window, and she would find that she had obeyed before she thought to mind it. The twins came to live at Wexley. Before the month was out for the widow, despite Eleanor's care and the physician, the Duke quietly sent and would not be thanked for, did not recover. Eleanor buried the gamekeeper's wife herself, stood at the grave as no one had stood at her own husband's for her, and brought the 2 children home to the warm stone house, and gave them a nursery with a fire in it and a nurse to mind them, and discovered that the want she had thought the years had killed in her had only been sleeping. Thomas followed her through the gardens, naming the flowers wrong on purpose to make her correct him. Susan, grave and watchful, took to standing at Eleanor's elbow the way Mrs. Chast Petch did, a small sentinel, and called her, one ordinary morning, Mamma, with no fuss at all, as though it had always been her name. And Eleanor had to leave the room so the child would not see what the word did to her. You may have guessed already where this is going, and I will not pretend you are wrong. Stay close, though, because the world that named her Barren was not finished with her, and it had followed her south wearing finer clothes. The Duke's own house, Ashbourne Court, lay 6 miles from Wexley across the same green country, and at Ashbourne Court there lived his mother, the Dowager Duchess, a woman of 70 who had spent 50 years as the most important person in any room she entered, and did not intend to stop. She heard, as such women always hear, that her son had been riding to Wexley with a frequency that errands could not account for. She made her own inquiries, and she arrived at Wexley one afternoon unannounced, in a carriage with the Ashbourne arms on the door, and sat in Eleanor's drawing-room with her gloved hands folded on the head of an ebony cane, and looked about the warm, bright room as though searching for the flaw she was certain it contained. The Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne was perfectly civil. That was the thing Eleanor came to understand about her, that her cruelty would never give the satisfaction of being openly cruel, that it would come dressed in courtesy so complete that to object to it would seem the rudeness. She admired the house. She admired the gardens. She inquired with sweet attention after the children, and when she learned that they were a gamekeeper's orphans, she let a small silence fall. And into that silence she said how very like Eleanor it was, how charitable, to take in such children, given that she had been unable to have her own. She said it gently. She said it as though offering sympathy. And the word she did not say sat in the room as plainly as if she had shouted it, and Eleanor felt the old cold settle on her, the Marbury cold, reaching all the way down into Somerset to find her. She kept her composure. She had 3 years' practice in keeping it. That night she stood at the nursery door watching the twins sleep, and she understood that the Dowager had come to begin a campaign, and that the campaign had an object, and that the object was a rival. The rival's name was Lady Honoria Vane, and she was everything Eleanor was not. She was the daughter of an earl, 24, and never disappointed of anything, with hair the color of wheat and a settled income, and a laugh she had practiced. The Dowager produced her at Ashbourne Court the following week, at a dinner to which Eleanor was invited in a manner designed to make refusal impossible and acceptance a humiliation, and Lady Honoria sat at the Duke's right hand in pale blue silk and diamonds, and talked of people Eleanor did not know, and places Eleanor had not been, and was, throughout, exquisitely kind to Eleanor in the particular way that is the cruelest thing a confident woman can do to an uncertain one. Eleanor wore her best gown, which was 2 seasons old, and her mother's thin gold ring, and she watched the Duke across the candlelight and could not read him at all, for his face at his mother's table had gone back to the carved stillness it had worn in the cold Marbury drawing-room, and she thought, with a sinking she despised herself for feeling, that perhaps she had imagined all of it, the watching and the tea without sugar, and the order to come away from the window. She did not imagine the moment after dinner, though when the ladies had withdrawn and Lady Honoria was at the pianoforte, and the Duke came and stood beside Eleanor at the long window, and said, low, that she was not eating, and that she should. It was the flat command again. The shelter dressed as instruction, and it steadied her even as her mind insisted she must not let it. Across the room, the dowager watched her son stand at the window with the widow from the north, and her gloved hand tightened on the head of her cane. And she began that evening to plan in earnest. What Eleanor did not know, and would not know until later, was the shape of the Duke's own wound. The thing that had set his face into stone and kept it there through 10 years and made the village of his own heart as careful and cold as the house she had left. He had been married once long before to a girl chosen for him by that same mother. A sweet, frightened girl who had wanted children, as Eleanor had wanted them, and who had died trying to bring one into the world. The child with her, on a winter night when the doctor came too late. Through the snow. He had been 30 miles away on business. His mother had judged more important. He had come home to 2 graves. He had never spoken of it to anyone, had turned his dead wife's portrait to the wall and locked the nursery that was never used, and had decided in the iron of his grief that he would not again be the cause of a woman's hope. Because hope, in his experience, was the thing that killed them. He carried her miniature still, the dead girl's, in the breast pocket of his coat, and when he was troubled, his hand went to it without his knowing. And Eleanor had seen the gesture twice, and thought it meant nothing. It was Mrs. Petch who told her the story, having had it from the Ashbourne housekeeper, the 2 of them being old acquaintances, and she told it plainly one evening by the fire, because she judged that her lady ought to know what she was dealing with. Eleanor sat very still while she heard it. She understood, listening, why the Duke gave shelter only in the form of orders, why he watched and would not say what he watched for, why a man who plainly felt something for her had let his mother seat a wheat-haired earl's daughter at his right hand without a word of protest. He was not cold. He was a man who believed his own warmth was a danger to whatever it touched, and who had decided long ago that the safest gift he could give a woman he cared for was distance. The knowledge did not make her hope. She had given up hope as a discipline. It made her ache for him instead, which is a different thing, and in some ways a worse one. The dowager moved quickly after that, for she had seen what Eleanor's stillness at the dinner had not hidden, and she did not mean to let it ripen. She let it be known, through the soft and certain channel such women command, that the new Baroness Wexley was perhaps not all she appeared. There were whispers that the inheritance was contested, that a man had come forward in London claiming the barony for the male line, that the title might be stripped from her as quickly as it had been given. There was worse. The dowager had learned somehow the word that Marbury had fastened on her, and she let that travel too gently, regretfully as a thing she was so sorry to repeat. Within a fortnight, the county that had curtsied to Eleanor began to hesitate. Invitations cooled. At church, the families that had pressed forward to know her drew back by inches. And the claimant in London, a real man with a real solicitor, proved no whisper at all but a true threat, a distant cousin of her uncle's who argued that the special remainder had been read too generously, and that the barony, and with it Wexley itself, ought to pass to him. The blow fell at the assembly. The autumn assembly was the great public occasion of the county, held in the long rooms above the inn at Taunton, and the whole neighborhood gathered there under the candle blaze. And the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne had chosen it as her ground. Eleanor came, because to stay away was to confess. She wore her 2-season gown, and her mother's ring, and she came alone, for the Duke had been 3 days in London on the business of the claim, and she did not know what he had found there. She had not been in the room 10 minutes before she understood the trap. The dowager stood in state at the head of the rooms with Lady Honoria beside her in silver, and as Eleanor crossed the floor the dowager's voice rose, pitched exactly as the rector's widow's voice had been pitched in the churchyard a lifetime ago, and said, to the cluster of county wives about her, that it was a sad thing, was it not, to see a barren woman play at being a mother and a baroness both, when by spring she might well be neither. The word landed in the sudden hush. The whole room had heard it. Faces turned. Lady Honoria looked at the floor with a small, practiced pity. And Eleanor stood alone in the center of the long, bright room, with 3 years of Marbury closing over her head, and felt the old belief rise up to claim her, that she was a woman built to be left, and that the world had only been pretending otherwise for a season. She did not run. That was the thing the dowager had not counted on, having mistaken stillness for weakness all her life. Eleanor stood in the silence and let it stretch. And then she said in a voice that did not shake, that she had buried a husband and a stranger uncle and a gamekeeper's wife within a single year, and that she had 2 children at home who called her mother, and who would never see the inside of a workhouse while she drew breath, and that the county might call her what it pleased, but the children would still be warm tonight. And that was the only verdict that had ever mattered to her. She inclined her head to the dowager with perfect courtesy, and she turned to leave the room with her back straight, having decided that she would keep Wexley if she could, and lose it if she must, but that she would not stand to be unmade by a word a second time. She had reached the head of the stairs when the doors below opened and the Duke of Ashbourne came up them, still in his travelling coat, the mud of the London road on his boots, having ridden through the night and come straight to the assembly because Mrs. Petch's message had reached him at the last change of horses, and he had not stopped since the room saw him. The room always saw him. He crossed the long floor without hurry, past his mother, past Lady Honoria in her silver, past the county wives, and he did not stop until he stood before Eleanor at the head of the stairs, in full view of every soul in the rooms, and the whole assembly held its breath to see what the Duke would do. He took her gloved hand. He looked only at her. And into the silence the dowager's word had made, he said plainly, so that every person in the long rooms heard it, "Eleanor, marry me, and let them choke on it." She did not answer at once. The room did not breathe. The Duke stood holding the hand of the widow from the north with the road still on him, and his face for the first time in that company was not carved stone at all, but the face of a man who had ridden 100 miles to say one true thing before he lost the nerve his grief had taught him. Behind Eleanor, the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne rose half out of her chair and sat down again, her gloved hand opening and closing on the head of her cane, and the words she had been so sure of all her life would not come to her. Lady Honoria looked at the Duke's face and understood, with the swift accuracy of a woman who has never been refused and has just been refused, that the field was lost and had perhaps never been hers, and she gathered her silver skirts and her dignity and moved aside. Eleanor looked up at him. She thought of his locked nursery and his turned portrait and the miniature in his breast pocket, of a man who had decided that his warmth was a danger and had crossed a crowded room to risk it anyway, in public, where there could be no taking it back. She thought of 2 children asleep in a warm house 6 miles away. And she said, yes, and she said it so quietly that only he could hear. But the room read it in his face before she finished the word, and a sound went through the assembly, like wind through standing corn. The Duke had brought more than a proposal up the London road. He had brought in the breast of his coat beside the miniature, the opinion of the finest authority on peerage law in England, who had read the special remainder and pronounced it sound beyond challenge, and he had brought a settlement of the claimant's pretended case that the man's own solicitor had signed. Having been shown that his client's argument would not survive a single morning in the Committee for Privileges, he laid these before the county not as triumph but as fact, quietly, the way he did everything, and the whisper the Dowager had launched died in the room where it had been loudest. The claim was over. The barony was Eleanor's sound and unassailable, and the woman the county had begun to draw back from was, within the hour, a woman every family in the rooms wished suddenly to have known all along. The Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne was not destroyed. The Duke would not have permitted it, and Eleanor did not wish it. She was corrected, which is a harder thing for the proud to bear than ruin. Her son came to her where she sat with her cane and said low, that Eleanor would be his wife and the mistress of Ashbourne Court, and that his mother might choose to know her grandchildren, or choose not to, but that the choice was the only power remaining to her in the matter, and that he advised her to choose well. The old woman looked from her son's unyielding face to the widow he had claimed, and something in her long calculation shifted, for she was not a stupid woman, only a frightened one who had hidden her fear inside her rank for 50 years, and she had just seen her son's face wear an expression she had not seen on it since before the snow and the two graves. She inclined her head to Eleanor. It was not warmth, yet it was a beginning, and Eleanor, who knew the cost of beginnings, accepted it as one. They were married before the first snow, quietly, in the small church at Wexley with the honey-colored stone, and not in the great, cold cathedral the dowager would have chosen. Mrs. Petch wept, and pretended she did not. Thomas carried the ring on a cushion, and dropped it once, and recovered it with great seriousness. Susan stood at Eleanor's side in a new white gown, grave and watchful as ever, a small sentinel, and when the rector named Eleanor a wife, the girl slipped her hand into Eleanor's hand and held it through the rest of the words. The Duke took her home to Ashbourne Court, and on the first night in that house he led her, with a stillness in him she had learned to read now, to a room at the end of the east wing that had been locked for 10 years. He unlocked it. Inside was a nursery, the dust of a decade on the cradle, and on the wall a portrait turned to face the plaster. He turned the portrait around. It showed a fair, frightened girl of 19, and he looked at it a long moment, and then he took the miniature from his breast pocket and set it on the mantel beneath the larger likeness. And he said, in the level voice that she now knew was the voice he used for the things that cost him most, and that he would like it to be a nursery again, if she were willing. Eleanor took his hand. She did not speak. Some yeses do not need the word. By spring, the room at the end of the east wing held 2 truckle beds and a fire kept burning, and Thomas had claimed the window seat for his fort, and Susan had claimed the Duke himself, following him through the house with her hand in his as she had once followed Eleanor, and the man who had locked his warmth away for 10 years was learning, slowly and with evident astonishment, that it had not killed anyone, after all. Eleanor stood in the doorway of that nursery one evening in April, with the Duke beside her, watching the children quarrel sweetly over a wooden horse in the firelight, and she felt the last of the Marbury cold go out of her for good. On the mantel, beneath the portrait of the fair girl who was at peace now, the small miniature still stood, and beside it, where Eleanor had placed it, lay her own mother's thin gold ring, the one thing she had carried out of the wreck of her first life and had not been able to sell. The 2 small keepsakes side by side in the warm light. A grave and a beginning kept together in the room that was no longer a grave. The snow that had once meant only death to this house fell soft and harmless outside the nursery window, and inside, by the fire, the children laughed, and Eleanor, whom a whole village had buried under a single word, sat down among the living she had been told she could never have, and was home. Thank you for staying with Eleanor to the end. If her story moved you, I would be glad to know which moment stayed with you. Be well, and be warm.